Now that you have built an observability architecture using Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, you are ready to address the capability that prevents chaos before it happens. Governance. Observability tells you what is happening, but governance decides what is allowed to happen. Without governance, you can see misconfigurations and risky deployments after the fact, but you still spend your life chasing drift and firefighting. With governance, you design guardrails so teams can move fast without repeatedly creating new risk, new cost leakage, and new audit failures. With that transition set, you need a definition that leaders can support and engineers can respect. Governance in Azure means creating clear standards, enforcing minimum requirements, and continuously measuring compliance so your cloud environment remains secure, operable, and financially controlled at scale. It is not about saying no. It is about making the safe path the default path. When governance is designed correctly, it removes confusion, reduces rework, and builds trust between leadership, security, platform teams, and delivery teams. With governance defined, you now frame Azure policy as a leadership tool that translates intent into control. Leaders set expectations like production resources must be tagged, logging must be enabled, and public exposure must be controlled. Azure policy is how those expectations become consistent rules across subscriptions and teams. Without this, governance becomes a manual process that depends on meetings, reminders, and individual discipline. With policy-driven governance, your organization shifts from best effort compliance to engineered compliance. And that is what leaders want when risk and accountability are real. With Azure policy positioned correctly, you now clarify the difference between standards, compliance, and guardrails because these terms are often confused. Standards describe what good looks like and how you want teams to build. Compliance is the measurement of whether the environment aligns to standards and obligations. Guardrails are enforceable minimum controls that prevent high-risk outcomes. In practice, you use standards to guide teams, compliance to measure reality, and guardrails to stop dangerous configurations from being deployed or from remaining in place. This clarity makes governance feel practical instead of abstract. With the terminology clear, you now set the principle that makes governance effective. You design governance around outcomes, reduce breach risk, improve reliability, predictable cost, and audit readiness. Checklists can be helpful, but checklists alone do not create safety if teams do not understand the why. When you align policies to outcomes, teams are more likely to adopt governance voluntarily because they can see it protects them as much as it protects the enterprise. Leaders also engage better when governance is presented as outcome-driven risk control rather than administrative burden. With outcomes anchored, you now connect governance to structure because scope determines whether governance is scalable. Your landing zone hierarchy gives you a way to apply governance at the right level so it is consistent across subscriptions without constant rework. Enterprise-wide guardrails belong at higher scopes and domain-specific policies belong at lower scopes. The leadership advantage is consistency with flexibility. The architectural advantage is a predictable model where teams inherit controls rather than reinventing them. With scope established, you now introduce the idea of policy initiatives in a way that supports leadership decision-making. A policy initiative is a collection of related policies that represent a governance package, such as a baseline security standard, a logging baseline, or a cost governance baseline. This helps you manage governance as a set of curated programs rather than a pile of independent rules. Leaders like this because it makes governance easier to sponsor and communicate. Architects like it because it creates a clean baseline that can be versioned, improved, and applied consistently. With governance packages in mind, You now describe the core guardrails that most enterprises need regardless of industry. You need identity-related guardrails to ensure privilege access and role assignments are controlled. You need network-related guardrails to reduce accidental exposure and enforce segmentation intent. You need logging guardrails to ensure evidence is collected and retained. You need data protection guardrails to ensure encryption and key management expectations are met. You need cost governance guardrails like tagging and budget accountability. The point is not to create endless rules. The point is to protect the foundations that every workload relies on. With core guardrails clear, you now address the biggest risk in governance programs, creating friction that drives teams toward workarounds. Guardrails must enable delivery by being predictable, consistent, and aligned to real delivery patterns. If guardrails are unclear or constantly changing, teams lose trust. If guardrails block common legitimate scenarios, teams will pressure leadership to bypass them. Your job is to design guardrails that reduce risk while providing paved roads, including approved patterns for common needs like private access, secure administration, and standard monitoring. With delivery enablement in mind, you now explain enforcement models in leadership terms. Some policies should prevent deployment of high-risk configurations because the risk is unacceptable. Some policies should flag non-compliance and drive remediation within a defined time window. Some policies should require an exception process when a business need exists. The key is choosing enforcement strength based on risk and business impact. Leaders care because enforcement models determine how risk is controlled without killing momentum. Architects care because predictable enforcement prevents last-minute surprises during releases. With enforcement models clear, you now address exceptions because every real enterprise needs them. An exception is not a loophole, it is a controlled risk decision. You define who can approve exceptions, what justification is required, what compensating controls are needed, and when the exception expires. You also make exceptions visible, so leadership can see where risk is being carried intentionally. This turns governance into a mature system that can handle real-world constraints without silently accumulating unmanaged risk. With exceptions governed, you now explain continuous compliance because governance is not a one-time assessment. Cloud environments change daily through deployments, configuration updates, and operational actions. Continuous compliance means you measure drift, report it, and drive remediation consistently. Leaders care because continuous compliance reduces audit surprises and improves risk posture. Architects care because drift measurement reveals where standards are unclear, where automation is needed, and where teams are struggling, which helps you improve the platform rather than blaming people. With continuous compliance established, you now focus on reporting because leaders need a story, not raw data. You design reporting that shows compliance posture by environment, by domain, and by criticality, highlighting trends over time and the highest risk gaps. You also show where exceptions exist and when they will be reviewed. This style of reporting helps leaders make decisions, fund remediation work, and hold owners accountable without needing to understand every technical detail. With leadership reporting clear, you now connect governance to cost, because cost drift is governance drift. If tagging is inconsistent, you cannot allocate cost properly. If non-production environments grow uncontrolled, costs expand without business value. If teams deploy expensive services without oversight, budgets are shocked. Governance guardrails create financial discipline, and financial discipline increases trust in cloud adoption. Leaders value this because it makes cloud spending explainable. Architects value it because cost governance supports sustainable platform growth without constant budget battles. With cost discipline in view, you now connect governance to security operations because guardrails must be operable, not theoretical. Security operations teams need consistent logging, consistent identity controls, and consistent network boundaries to detect threats and respond quickly. Azure Policy supports security operations by reducing variance and preventing blind spots. Leaders care because consistent controls reduce incident impact. Architects care because operable security controls reduce the number of emergency changes needed during incidents. With the governance model complete, you now ground it in a scenario that demonstrates value. Imagine a team under delivery pressure tries to deploy a storage service with public network access enabled and without required tags or logging. Without guardrails, it goes live and becomes a hidden risk until a security review or incident exposes it. With Azure Policy Guardrails, the deployment is either blocked or flagged immediately, and the team is guided toward the approved private access pattern and logging baseline. Leadership avoids a potential breach headline. The team avoids rework later, and the organization moves faster because standards are clear. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can design governance that leaders trust and teams can live with. Governance turns observability into control by defining what is allowed to happen and measuring compliance continuously. Azure Policy is a leadership tool that translates standards into enforceable guardrails across your landing zone hierarchy. Standards define what good looks like. Compliance measures reality, and guardrails prevent high-risk outcomes. Effective governance is outcome-driven, applied at the right scope, packaged through policy initiatives, and balanced to enable delivery rather than create workarounds. Enforcement models should match risk, exceptions must be controlled and time-bound, and continuous compliance must measure drift and drive remediation. Reporting should give leaders a clear narrative, and governance must also support cost discipline and security operations readiness. If you want your Azure environment to scale with control instead of chaos, subscribe so you can continue through the rest of this playlist and build the complete enterprise architecture. Like this video so more leaders and architects learn practical cloud governance. Comment with your biggest governance challenge such as exception management, compliance reporting, or policy scope design, and share this with your team so you can align on standards, reduce drift, and build guardrails that enable secure and reliable delivery.